I spent more than 30 hours this week researching and writing about week 12 of fantasy football. Come and take advantage of that. I'm going to spend the next hour, maybe 2 hours, answering as many fantasy football questions as I possibly can, again, over the next 60 to 120 minutes, right here, right now, live on episode 47 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. What is up, my friend? Happy Friday. Welcome back. Welcome to the live Ask Mikey Anything show every Friday at noon Central over on the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football YouTube channel or wherever you're watching. I think people might be on Facebook and Patreon and Twitch, which I've never actually been on, but shout out to Tanner for getting us all over the place. But welcome back every Friday, noon Central. And like I mentioned in the intro, I'm going to spend the next 60 or lately we've been going 120 minutes just talking fantasy football, answering as many fantasy football questions as I can, just talking football. If you have questions for this week's show, drop them in the comments. Looks like there's already plenty to get to. Of course, as I like to do on these shows, the best possible way to start a weekend here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin is with a 12 o'clock beer. And every week I try to drink a different beer right here live on the show. And today we are going to go with a Hazy Rabbit IPA from Lakefront Brewery. Now, to be clear, I actually don't really care. I don't hate IPAs. I know there's very much a love-hate relationship. Like people either seem to love them or hate them. I don't hate them, but I don't love them either. They're not my favorite. I drink them, but they're not my favorite. Now, that said, I will say Lakefront Brewery is my second favorite brewery in Wisconsin behind Enlightened Brewery. And no, this is not a paid sponsorship for either brewery, but Lakefront makes some of my favorite beers. River West Stein is always up there for me. They also used to, I think it was just a temporary thing, but they used to make a Mexican lager, and I don't think they do it anymore. I think it was like a seasonal one-time thing that they tried, but it was awesome. It was the best Mexican lager that I've ever had in my entire life. Quick side note, I'm seeing a little note on my side that says my internet connection is not great, meaning you guys might not even be hearing or seeing me. Can somebody just drop in the comments whether or not everything is good on your side? Thank you. But without further ado, let's give I've had the Hazy Rabbit IPA before, but it's been a while. I haven't had it in a while. As I mentioned on the last show, we're picked clean on beer right now. We had a Halloween party and we just got completely wiped out on beer and we just haven't gotten around to restocking yet. But without further ado, let's give it a try. Hazy Rabbit IPA from Lakefront Brewery here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. By the way, they do the best brewery tour. If you're in Milwaukee, I love their brewery tour. It's a really good time. All right. See, as far as IPAs go, this is not bad. This is a pretty good one. I don't know if it's available outside of Milwaukee, possibly not. So this might be a waste of time for anybody who's not in Milwaukee. But if you are, Hazy Rabbit is solid as far as IPAs go. Again, I know there's a love-hate thing there. All right, guys, let's get into the meat. Let's get into the real reason you're here. You're not here to watch me drink beer, but Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. I figure we got to incorporate beer, right? A quick couple ground rules if this is your first time tuning into the show. So, as I mentioned, leave your questions, leave your concerns, leave your dilemmas, your conundrums, anything that you're facing in Week 12, leave them in the comments. And I'm going to do everything that I can to answer as many questions as I can over the next 1 to 2 hours. Now, I do want to mention there's no guarantee that I'm going to be able to answer more than one question per person. That's part of what got me in trouble in the last few weeks is I would try and address every single question. I'm going to do my best to get to at least one question per person, but there's no guarantee that I'll be able to come back and get 2, 3, 4, 5 questions from everybody. Number 2, if you're looking for a show, if you're looking for something where it's going to be a quick hit answers, where I'm just going to boom, 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 fire off yes or no, it's just not going to happen. That's not the way that this show works. Instead, the way that I approach the show is to take your dilemma, take your conundrum, and approach it as if it's my own. So I walk through my very own process as if it's my own league. This is what I do every Sunday morning when I'm setting my lineups. I'm going to take your conundrum and walk through my entire process. And guess what? Sometimes that is going to take a while, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Some of these things can run 15 minutes at a time for one question. And that's just the way it goes. If you're looking for a quick hitting yes or no, or this guy, it's just not going to happen. And that's because I want to give you the most informed possible answer that I possibly can, because the whole idea for fantasy football is putting ourselves in the best possible position to be correct, knowing that we're not going to be right about everything, but what can we do to increase the likelihood that we're going to make the right decision? Okay. Last but not least, the whole reason what we're going to walk through today, and if you've never been here before, we're going to be walking through a resource that I create every single week called the heat map. The heat map is what started this entire journey. It's what led to me quitting my corporate career to start doing this full time as a fantasy football analyst. It led to me starting my own business, Basement Brood Fantasy Football LLC, which was never in my life plans. I never in my life thought I would be running a business, which, by the way, is the most impossible thing on the planet. But the heat map itself created itself many, many years ago because I was struggling with these start-sit conundrums. Every single week, it was this guy or this guy. I got to leave one guy on my bench. I got to put 2 guys in. Who do I pick? And I started creating a resource, which turned out to be the heat map, where I would basically research every single player in every single game, every single week, and start putting them into lists of, I love this guy this week. I like this guy this week. I feel just okay about this guy. I don't like this guy, and I won't even consider this guy. And eventually that got to a point where one of my friends was like, dude, you got to put this thing on Reddit. People would love this thing. People would use this thing. And I almost didn't. I almost did not put it on Reddit because I don't know if you've been over there. There are some very unhappy humans over on Reddit, and they're all anonymous. There's no profile pictures. People don't use their real name. So people can say what they want. And I'm very thin skinned. I'm a sensitive guy. Okay. So I almost didn't do it, but eventually I put it on Reddit, and thankfully it kind of blew up. It was a success. People enjoyed it. People asked for it. I got to a point where there were complete strangers in my DMs asking for my Venmo, which is Basement Brood, by the way, I think Basement Brood. They started asking for my Venmo so that they could donate money to keep using the resource. So anyway, it led to me quitting my corporate career and going through this full time. So every single week I put together this resource. It takes me 30 plus hours researching literally every single player in every single game to give all of us the best possible opportunity to win. In fact, I did a survey recently, and it had 3 very simple questions, and I sent it to everybody that I knew. 3 very simple questions. Number 1 was, did you use the weekly heat map when setting your lineups this week? Number 2 was, across all your leagues, how many of your matchups did you win? And number 3 was, how many did you lose? Of the people that did not use the heat map, 50%, they won 50% of their matchups. Exactly. Like, it wasn't one more or less. It was exactly 50%. Of the people that did use the weekly heat map, they won 64% of their matchups. So it's literally math at this point. We have data at this point that people who use the heat map win more frequently than people who don't. Plain and simple. All right, guys, let's get into these comments. Looks like there's quite a few that are flooding in here. So before we jump in and really dig into all of the meat, all of the nooks, all of the crannies, a quick note from our sponsor. Are you a software wizard, a code ninja, a forge master, or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. Man, I always appreciate a good promo video that gives me an opportunity to do a quick wardrobe change. It was getting pretty sweaty down here pretty quickly, starting to stink down in the basement. All right, let's get into this thing. JP's popping in. He's saying intro music gets me pumped up every single time. Me too, dude. It's kind of funny. I click the button and then I always just kind of start dancing a little bit. I got to be honest, though. I don't think I like my new intro song as much as my old intro song. I got to talk to Tanner about whether or not there's a way we can get that back, but I think it's long gone. I do. OBJ says, big week of football ahead, Mikey. These next few weeks will decide a lot. Yeah, man. And this week in particular, week 12, the bye week apocalypse, as a lot of people like to refer to it. It's going to give people an opportunity to make a move in the standings, good or bad. It might not necessarily be a good thing. All right, we got a couple questions to start with here from I do OBJ. Give me 1 second to take a drink of my beer and pick which one I want to go with here. All right. We'll just start with this top one because this probably is the one that's top of mind for I do OBJ. Let me pump up the heat map here, guys. I don't know how well you can see this on your side. It's not really showing up that well, at least on my screen. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. By the way, I'm going to drop just in the comments here real quick. If you guys are wanting to just get the heat map for yourself, obviously we're going to walk through it as much as we can today, but if you want it for yourself for week 12, you can get it for $4.99. If you want it for the rest of the season, all the way through the Super Bowl, you can get it for literally just $1.90 per heat map. That's about as close as I can get to giving it away for free. I just dropped it in the comments if you want to scoop up the heat maps. Again, people who use the heat map when setting their lineup win more frequently than people who don't. Period. It's math. It's data. But let's get into this. Again, I apologize if you can't really see it all that well. It's as big as I can handle on this side. That's what she said. In a full PPR situation, do you like Deebo Samuel at Green Bay or Cortland Sutton at Las Vegas? So, quick caveat and quick thing to note. Usually I am spending the majority of Tuesday through Thursday writing this bad boy. Like I'm spending all of Tuesday, all of Wednesday, all of Thursday writing 200 plus players in the heat map. By the time Thursday night football rolls around, I'm usually gassed. I'm exhausted. I need to unplug from my computer. I need to unplug from football. Like as much as I love football, you need to take a break after you spend that much time on it in a short amount of time. So the point is, usually from Thursday night football until this moment, I'm unplugged from NFL news, injury news. Now, the last I heard, Brock Purdy left practice yesterday with a shoulder injury. And while that's not automatically super concerning, the Vegas line on this game shifted pretty dramatically in a very short amount of time. The Packers went from 1.5 point favorites to 3 point favorites almost instantly. And a lot of times when you see that happens, it means take this with a grain of salt, but a lot of times it suggests that somebody with insider knowledge placed a pretty sharp amount of money on the game, enough money to move the line. If the line moves from 1.5 to 3 like that, that does not happen often, right? It might go from 1.5 to 2, back down to 1.5, down to 1, but jumping from 1.5 to 3 is not a good sign for Brock Purdy's availability. We're going to learn a lot today about practice, whether or not they elevate somebody off the practice squad. And one thing I will say is if they move on, if they do not have Brock Purdy on Sunday, I like all of their pass catchers a lot less than I would if Brock Purdy's in there. Brock Purdy's been balling out. There's no way to sugarcoat it. It is a downgrade if they have to go with Brandon Allen. Now, it's possible they go with Joshua Dobbs. I remember I did a research study on Joshua Dobbs last year when he got traded to the Vikings. He's actually a significant fantasy football weapon, but he also does a good job of delivering the football to fantasy relevant wide receivers. So we're praying that if it's not Brock Purdy, it's Dobbs and not Brandon Allen, but there's just no way of knowing that right now. So I do OBJ. Feel free to send me an email once after, like as the weekend goes on, and we can reevaluate this question. Mikey at basementbroodff.com. In fact, I'll just type that in the comments real quick. At basementbroodff.com. If you want anybody who's listening, feel free to send any questions that you have to that email. I'll do my best to get back to it. But let's just move forward as if Brock Purdy's going to give it a go. Okay. So we got Deebo Samuel, and it's been, there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's been disappointing. I don't know if I'm going to be able. See, I have to shrink this back down. It doesn't look big on your computer screen. That's what she said. But on my side, on the back end, it's overwhelmingly big. That's what she said. So I have to tone it down there a notch. All right. Deebo Samuel. Bottom line, we're treating him like a high-end wide receiver 3 with some upside in this potentially high-scoring game. Now, over on the left side of the heat map, you always see the over-unders, the spreads, the implied totals. Those things are critical when it comes to making fantasy football decisions, at least in my process. Which, quick second to build the resume a little bit. It's been a successful path as a fantasy football player, as a fantasy football analyst. I've taken down DFS contests. I've won like March Madness style contests with over 64 participants in a season-long league. Like, I have a very specific process that I go through when setting my lineups, and that's where the heat map comes in. Now, the 49ers at Packers, we feel good about this game in general, or at least we did feel good about this game before the Brock Purdy news. If Brock Purdy's out, that's going to change things quite a bit. But if we're assuming Brock Purdy plays, this game looks like a good one. It's a nice over-under of 47.5 points, which was tied for the 4th highest among all 13 games on the Week 12 slate. Now, both teams are sporting top 13 implied totals, meaning they're both in the they're both in the top half of projected points for this week. And oftentimes that suggests a possible shootout where both teams are scoring a lot of touchdowns and ultimately fantasy football points. The 49ers themselves, solid implied point total, 23 points, tied for the 13th most among all 26 teams. Again, this is going to change if Brock Purdy doesn't play. As of right now, they were 1.5 point underdogs, which suggests a neutral game script, a balanced offensive approach. They're currently 3-point underdogs, which is still narrow enough of a spread to suggest a neutral-ish game script that could turn into a negative game script and force them to put the ball in the air, which would ultimately be a good thing from Deebo Samuel. Of course, it depends on who's going to be delivering that football. Now, Deebo himself, it hasn't been pretty, right? He's averaging 12.7 PPR points per game after 8 games, where he played at more than 4 snaps. He scored 18 or more PPR points in 3 of 8 games. That's it. He's only 38% of the time he's getting you 18 or more PPR points. Otherwise, he's landing between 10 to 13 PPR points 38% of the time, and he scored fewer than 7 points in 2 of 8 games, or about 25% of the time. Now, one thing that we do like about Deebo Samuel is that he has 60 touches and 569 scrimmage yards this year, but he only has 2 touchdowns this season, and he's climbing up the positive touchdown regression tab, the positive touchdown regression cheat sheet that I put together for my subscribers every single week. So down here on the bottom, we were on the heat map. You'll see that there's a tab for streamers and stashes, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point, and touchdown regression. And the touchdown regression tab tells you mathematically who's due, who is due to score a touchdown, who should have more touchdowns than they do with the touches and the yards that they have. This takes into account the last 5 years of data for each position and gives us a baseline of, okay, typically if wide receivers have this many touches and this many yards, they should be somewhere around this many touchdowns. And Deebo Samuel is starting to climb up that list. He's about 1.5 touchdowns behind where he quote unquote should be. Obviously, that's not a silver bullet. That's not a guarantee he's going to score. But I will say that we've seen Basement Brood Fantasy Football subscribers cash in on anytime touchdown parlays using the touchdown regression cheat sheet. Okay. So we like that about Deebo Samuel. We like that he's climbing up that list. He should find the end zone sooner or later. Now, the matchup itself, a lot of it depends on whether or not Jair Alexander's playing. But overall, the Green Bay Packers are holding wide receivers to the 12th fewest PPR points per game. That includes the 15th fewest catches, 10th fewest yards, and 16th fewest touchdowns. So mostly mediocre against wide receivers. They're not a nightmare matchup. They're not a cakewalk matchup. They're just kind of hovering in the middle of the pack, if you will. That's my favorite joke. I'm going to use it every single week. 9 wide receivers at the individual level, though, right? That was at the team level. But when you drill down into the individual level, you'll start to see some weakness for the Packers. 9 wide receivers in 10 games have scored 15 or more PPR points against the Packers, including 3 that scored more than 20. Usually, the best bet for that to happen on the 49ers side of the ball would be Deebo Samuel. Now, Juwan Jennings has been balling out, but Deebo Samuel is a decent bet to be the guy to score 15 or more PPR points against the Packers if somebody's going to do it. Now, that being said, just 2 wide receivers in the last 5 games have been able to reach 14 PPR points, and none were able to get to 19 against the Packers. You can see the list of names that have been able to hit against the Packers, and usually the people that make this list are the ones that score 15 or more PPR points. And I always give you a list of noteworthy players that just kind of pooped the bed and did not perform well against the Green Bay Packers, and that list is down here. So ultimately, in a shootout, a possible shootout against a not necessarily terrifying matchup as a touchdown regression candidate, we feel good. We feel cautiously optimistic. We feel closer to good than bad about putting Deebo Samuel in our lineup, and that's why he's in the yellow column, the Met column with a green dot. He's approaching column B, the column where I'd feel good about having this player in my lineup. Now, that being said, the question is about Deebo Samuel versus Courtland Sutton. And generally speaking, Courtland Sutton is, he's definitely outperforming Deebo Samuel. That's not even a question. That's not even close, but he's performing really well. He's quietly giving us wide receiver 1 numbers right now. Like I said, bottom line, Courtland Sutton is putting up wide receiver 1 numbers as of late, but he's more of a wide receiver 2 in this particular matchup. It's a very difficult matchup. He's already struggled in this matchup once this year. Now, the game itself, we feel fine about it from the Broncos side. The Broncos have a solid implied point total of 24 points. Like, Denver's offense is clicking right now. This is turning into one of the better scoring offenses in the NFL, and they have an implied point total of 24 points. That is the 9th most among all 26 teams on the slate this week. They're expected to be a top 9 scoring team in football. That's a good sign for anybody involved on Denver's offense. This, generally speaking, is an offense that you want exposure to in your week 12 lineups. And really, when it comes to pass catchers in Denver, it's Courtland Sutton and a bunch of nothing. Now, the Broncos are strong 6.5 point road favorites. 6.5 points is a wide-ish spread. A spread that suggests very positive game script. Like the Broncos theoretically aren't at risk of abandoning the run. They're going to be able to keep the football on the ground. It should create a run-heavy approach as the Broncos are trying to kill the clock in the second half. Now, sometimes that is troubling for the target volume of pass catchers in that offense. Like, if the Broncos got ahead by 30, they have no reason to throw the ball 30, 40 times a game, and that's where Courtland Sutton butters his bread. He needs targets to be able to score fantasy football points. Now, 6.5 points is a wide-ish spread, but it's not like last week we saw the Lions have a 13.5 point spread over the Jaguars. We're not necessarily that gigantic, but it is a pretty positive game script. Now, Courtland Sutton himself, over 11 games, he's getting you about 12 PPR points and 7.7 targets per game, but he's quietly dominating over the last month. He's averaging 17.8 PPR points and 9.5 targets per game over the last 9 games, scoring 14 or more PPR points in all of them. Okay. His career against the Raiders. Okay. Earlier this year, and this is interesting, he scored just 5.2 PPR points against the Raiders in week 5. That was one of 4 games where he scored fewer than 8 PPR points this year. It was his 3rd worst game of the season so far to this point. Now, entering the season, before week 5, Courtland Sutton entered the season averaging 14.3 PPR points and 8.1 targets per game over 8 career games where he played at least 46 offensive snaps against the Raiders. As you can see, I get really deep into the weeds, really deep into the details when I'm analyzing. I do this for 200 plus players, so you can imagine why I need to unplug come Thursday Night Football. Courtland Sutton scored 16 or more PPR points in 4 of 8 games against the Raiders, including a high of 23.4 way back in week 6 of 2021. His only game over 19 PPR points against the Raiders. He scored fewer than 10 points in 2 of 10 games against the Raiders, including a low of 1.9 back in week 2 of 2018. Now, this year, the Raiders are pretty good against wide receivers. They're holding wide receivers to the 7th fewest PPR points per game, which includes the 7th fewest catches, 3rd fewest yards, and 12th fewest touchdowns. Just 9 wide receivers in 10 games. Excuse me, that IPA is coming back at me. Just 9 wide receivers in 10 games have been able to reach. This is a big one. Just 9 wide receivers in 10 games have been, so less than 1 wide receiver per game has been able to reach 10 PPR points against the Raiders. Only 3 of them were able to get the 15. Like, Raiders just do not, or wide receivers just do not perform well against the Raiders this year. Just 1 wide receiver in the last 7 games has been able to reach 14 points against the Raiders. You can see here who hit: Zay Flowers, Deontay Johnson, Ladd McConkey, Tyreek Hill. Those are pretty much the only guys that had a good day against the Raiders. And here's the list of players that didn't: Amari Cooper, Cortland Sutton himself, George Pickens, Jamar Chase, which is a pretty big one, and Jalen Waddle, who isn't hitting against anybody this year. Maybe I should just take him out of the list. So we feel pretty good about Cortland Sutton in general. We definitely don't love him in that much this week in particular. Now, I'll say, if Brock Purdy does not play in this game, it's Cortland Sutton. Like, right now, it's a toss-up between the two. And if Purdy doesn't play, it's Cortland Sutton. I hate to say it, but that's what it is. And as of right now, it looks like Purdy won't play. The 49ers implied total dropped all the way down to 21.75. That's a below average, that's in the bottom half of the NFL. Cortland Sutton's going to give you a better chance at scoring a touchdown just based on the Broncos' implied point total. And it's really hard to bench a guy that's getting 9+ targets per game in favor of a guy who's really hasn't been doing all that much this year, despite injuries in San Francisco's offense. If it were me in this situation, I would be going with Cortland Sutton as a quote unquote safer play. Like, the guy's getting 9+ targets. He should get you something in fantasy football. But if you need to swing for the fences, and we know that Brock Purdy is going to be going to play, that's the big if. If Brock Purdy plays and you need to hit a home run, Deebo Samuel is going to bring that upside in this potential shootout. He just doesn't have as safe of a floor as Cortland Sutton. So TLDR, Cortland Sutton is the safer floor ceiling combination, whereas Deebo Samuel is the, hey, I need a grand slam if Brock Purdy's going to play. So hope that helps. All right. Woo! Quick drink of the Hazy Rabbit IPA from Lakefront Brewery. Again, this is not a paid promotion. I just enjoy beer at noon. All right, guys, if you're liking the heat map, again, I do this for every single player, every single game, every single week. You can get it for $4.99, less than the cost of this. Like, this beer costs more than the heat map does. And the heat map takes 30+ hours a week to write. So you can get it for $4.99, or you can get the whole rest of the season all the way through the Super Bowl for just $1.90 per heat map. Wild. I just dropped the link for that in the comments. All right. Let's see. What are we going to go to next? I didn't even take that drink of the beer yet. Jerry Jeudy or Josh Downs rest of season? Love this question, Scott. For me, it's Jeudy. I joked yesterday in my fantasy football Discord server, which, by the way, if you love fantasy football, you got to join this thing. We got 199 and counting fantasy football players in here just talking ball all day, every day. And yesterday I jokingly said I have a really uncomfortable amount of Jerry Jeudy in the game tonight. And I was pleased with what he got. I think it was like 6 catches for 80 something yards. Dude is getting force fed by Jameis. As long as Jameis Winston is playing quarterback, I want like maximum exposure to the Browns passing attack. Let me scroll up to Jerry Jeudy here just to remind myself. He's averaging 17. This is not taking into account yesterday's game, but he's averaging 17.8 PPR points per game after 3 games with Jameis Winston, and he got 14 plus more PPR points yesterday. He's getting 10 targets per game from Jameis Winston. And if we know anything about Jameis Winston, it's that dude is willing to chuck the ball. Like he got career years. Mike Evans got career years out of Jameis Winston. Chris Godwin had some career years out of Jameis Winston. The dude's willing to just fling it. And Jerry Jeudy looks like he's going to be the top target. Cedric Tillman was in concussion protocol. He might not even play next week. He probably will. Thursday to Sunday is a pretty big gap. It's plenty of time to pass. But either way, Jerry Jeudy looks like possibly the top option. Anytime you get a guy getting 10 targets per game, you want that guy. Josh, I'm not a fan of wide receivers in Anthony Richardson's offense. Like it's going to be about as boom or bust as it gets. They still got Michael Pittman over there. Josh Downs is going to have some good days, but Jerry Jeudy is legitimately going to be a high volume wide receiver over the course of the rest of the season. Now, I will note his schedule is brutal. Like I don't think he has a single good matchup for the whole rest of the year. But 10 targets, it almost doesn't even matter. Hope that helps. All right, let's go. JP, Jordan Poggle, my man. Need an RB2 and a flex out of these three. James Conner, Aaron Jones, Devontae Smith. Half PPR, okay? That's always an important distinction. So, guys, if you're leaving comments for me, make sure you let me know if we're talking PPR, half PPR, standard, tight end premium, super flex. Make sure you let me know those things. Half PPR means we're looking for touchdowns here. And I will tell you right off the bat, just looking at this, the Vikings have the lowest implied point total out of these three teams, out of the Eagles and out of the Cardinals. That automatically gives, it's not a death sentence, but it automatically puts a little bit of a red flag on Aaron Jones when considering all these guys. Now, typically speaking, before we get into what the heat map says, running back is going to give you a safer bet than wide receiver, especially in a half PPR league, because it's guaranteed volume. Like we know, as long as he doesn't get hurt, we know Aaron Jones is going to get 15-ish touches. Devontae Smith is very hit. Like dude can get you 9 targets. He could get you 4. Like there's always going to be some boom or bust there, usually at wide receiver, but especially with a guy like Devontae Smith. So James Conner and Aaron Jones right off the bat are going to be safer plays. The Vikings are favored over the Bears. The Cardinals are favored over the Seahawks. Those are going to be safer options than Devontae Smith. But that's what the heat map is for, man. That's why we get into all of the data on all of these players so that we can walk out of it with the most educated decision possible. I'm not just going to throw up a list of rankings and be like, hey, this guy's on top of this guy, so pick him. That's not the way we do things at BBFF. All right, let's go. James Conner is going to be the first one. That's game number 11 on the heat map. Cardinals at Seahawks. James Conner is in the yellow column, floating towards the green column. That's a good sign. Bottom line, James Conner is a confident RB2 with some upside in this potentially high-scoring game and a matchup that he's shredded throughout his Cardinals career. So let's start with the game script, and it's a good one. That's what the green dot here is all about, okay? Cardinals at Seahawks as a solid over-under of 47.5 points, tied for the 4th highest among all 13 games on the Week 12 slate, meaning both teams are sporting top 13 implied totals of 23 or more, suggesting a possible shootout and plenty of fantasy football points, okay? So both the Cardinals and the Seahawks are expected to score in the top half of the NFL this week, meaning shootout, touchdowns, fantasy points. Generally speaking, this is a game that you want exposure to in your Week 12 fantasy football lineups. If I had to build a fantasy football lineup out of one game this week, Seahawks Cardinals would be in that conversation. The Cardinals themselves, they have a solid implied total, 24.5 points. That's tied for the 7th most among all 26 teams. This is an offense that you want exposure to in your Week 12 fantasy football lineups. They're going to score touchdowns. Touchdowns give you fantasy points. You need yards to get touchdowns. You need catches to get yards. All of those things, like one thing leads to the other. You can go from the top down or the down top. That doesn't make sense. But if we know that the Cardinals are going to score points, how are they going to do that? Touchdowns. How are they going to get touchdowns? Yards. How are they going to get yards? Catches, right? So all of these things work together. It's all baked in. That's why Vegas lines are such a huge part of my process moving forward. The Cardinals are narrow 1.5 point road favorites. So that suggests a neutral game script, a balanced offensive approach. This thing could go back and forth. It's not going to be one team blowing out the other team. James Conner should stay plenty involved unless somehow the Seahawks get out to this really hot start and the Cardinals fall behind and they need to pass the ball a ton. But the script doesn't currently reflect that happening. James Conner himself, it's been a fine season. He's not lighting the world on fire, but he's not pooping the bed either. He's getting you dang near 15 PPR points per game after 10 games. He's getting you 18 plus touches per game. He's not particularly involved in the passing game. He gets you about 2.4 catches on 3 targets per game. We'd like to see those numbers a little bit higher for both floor and ceiling purposes, but it's been fine. He's been kind of all over the place in terms of weekly output. He gets you 17 or more PPR points about half the time, 5 out of 10 games. He also landed below 9 PPR points in 2 of 10 games. So only about 20% of the time he's getting you below 9. He's usually landing somewhere between, well, he's usually getting you 17 or more. And if not, he's landing somewhere between 12 and 15. So pretty safe option, right? We're saying that 80% of the time he's getting you at least 12 PPR points. That's safe. Obviously, this is half PPR, so that changes things a little bit, but he's also getting you a half a touchdown a game. So he has a 50% chance of scoring a touchdown this game, theoretically, right? It goes a lot deeper than just that. But now, against Seattle, James Conner has been balling since he arrived in Arizona. He's averaging 22.5 PPR points and 22.5 touches per game in 4 career games against the Seahawks since joining the Cardinals. He scored 20 or more PPR points in 3 out of 4 games against Seattle, including outings of 27.3 and 30.4, one of which was in week 18 of last year. And before you think, oh, you know, they rested like week 18, they might have rested. Arizona played all of their starters in week 18 last year. Now the Seahawks against running backs, they're allowing the 11th most PPR points per game. That includes the 8th most touches, 4th most scrimmage yards. They are vulnerable on the ground. They are allowing the 3rd most rushing yards and 12th most rushing touchdowns. Emphasis on touchdowns. That's what we're looking for in half PPR. They're stingy through the air. They're holding running backs to the 12th fewest catches, 14th fewest receiving yards, no receiving touchdowns. But again, James Conner's getting less than 3 catches a game anyway. We're looking for him to butter his bread here on the ground. Okay. And that part is a good matchup. 5 running backs in 10 games have been able to score 15 or more PPR points against the Seattle Seahawks. You can see the list of names that did well here, the list of names here that busted. But I mean, there's only been 7 running backs this year that have handled 15 or more touches, 5 of which were able to score 15 or more PPR points. We're feeling good about James Conner. It's a high scoring game. It's a neutral game script. He's done well in this matchup in the past. The matchup itself is not scary. Without even reviewing the other 2 names, I already feel really good about James Conner being an option. Okay. Let's go Aaron Jones. Man, I always get the gas bubbles. Maybe I need to rethink this beer thing. Vikings Bears. This is going to be game number 2. Aaron Jones has been in a little bit of a slump here, which we'll get to. Right here, bottom line. Aaron Jones is a slumping RB2, but one who could get back on track with a solid matchup, game script, and touchdown regression working in his favor. Now, Vikings at Bears, the game total is not pretty. The over-under is just 39.5. That's not pretty at all. It's the 2nd lowest among all 13 games. That suggests, and both teams are sporting bottom 10 implied point totals under 22 points. So it suggests a low-scoring slugfest, 2 pretty solid defenses that won't feature many touchdowns or fantasy football fireworks. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to bench Justin Jefferson, for example. It's just saying there's very little reason to think, hey, this game could be 30-30. There's going to be a ton of touchdowns. It's actually likely to be the opposite. It's going to be closer to what we saw last night with the Browns Steelers than it would be. I don't know if you guys remember that Chiefs Rams game many years ago. That was like 50-40 or something. Now, the Vikings in particular, they have a slightly subpar implied point total of 21.5 points. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not good. It's tied for the 10th fewest among all 26 teams. They're not an offense that you need to force into your lineups, but you can definitely get the usual suspects like Justin Jefferson. Aaron Jones is usually one of them. They are 3.5 point favorites. This is a good thing. They're suggesting a neutral, positive game script, a balanced offensive approach. They're averaging 29.4 passing attempts and 29.3 rushing attempts per game. There's no reason to expect a shift in that in week 12. They should be able to keep the ball on the ground as much as they'd like in week 12. Aaron Jones himself, he's got the little frozen face going on right here. He's averaging 15.1 PPR points per game after 9 full games in that nauseating purple and yellow that the Vikings prefer to wear. But it hasn't been great lately. He's averaging just 10.3 PPR points per game over his last 4 games, ever since suffering that injury that he's I don't know if he's been playing through it, but it's been since that injury. He is getting 20.3 touches per game, but he's failed to reach 13 PPR points in any of those 4 games that he's getting 20 touches per game. Now, like Deebo Samuel, he is on the touchdown regression tab. That's a good sign. He has 186 touches, 954 scrimmage yards, but he has just 3 touchdowns this season. It should be higher than that. No touchdowns since week 7. He's high on the positive touchdown regression tab. In fact, he's number 1. He's number 1 among running backs, and he's number 2 overall among all the players on this list. Aaron Jones is the highest on the touchdown regression tab. We really like that for Aaron Jones. The matchup is mediocre. The Bears are giving up the 12th most PPR points per game to enemy running backs. They are giving up the 15th most touchdowns to running backs. So they're right in the middle of the pack. They're not like this great matchup. They're not a terrifying matchup. They're vulnerable on the ground. They're giving up the 8th most rushing yards and 9th most rushing touchdowns to running backs. That's a very good sign for Aaron Jones, especially a guy who's quote unquote due to score a touchdown. They are stingy through the air, holding running backs to the 9th fewest receiving yards and no receiving touchdowns, despite allowing the 16th most catches. Now, Aaron Jones he's been fine through the air, 3.1 catches on 3.6 targets per game. So he's getting some receiving work, but he's not like, we're not talking Alvin Kamara, Devon Achane type of numbers there. So he's going to be looking to butter his bread on the ground, which is where the Chicago Bears are vulnerable to begin with. 6 running backs in 10 games have been able to reach 16 PPR points against the Bears, 3 of which went past 20 PPR points, but just 8 running backs in 10 games have been able to reach even just 9 points against the Bears. Ultimately, it's a pretty solid hit list. Tony Pollard, Jonathan Taylor, Kyron Williams, Chuba Hubbard, Cardinals running backs, and Josh Jacobs, they all did well against Chicago, whereas Brian Robinson and Ramondre Stevenson are really the only 2 names that kind of missed the mark against Chicago. So ultimately, we're feeling good-ish about Aaron Jones. That's why he's in the yellow column with a green dot. We're feeling good about the game script. We're feeling fine about the matchup. We love that he's a touchdown regression candidate. We love that the Bears give up the 9th most touchdowns to running backs. The Vikings aren't expected to score as many points as the Cardinals, so I wouldn't say I'd be ranking him ahead of James Conner. I like James Conner more than I like Aaron Jones, but I don't dislike Aaron Jones this week. In fact, I scooped him up in a Survivor League that has no bench where he was a free agent. I scooped him up to use him this week. Last but not least, we got Devontae Smith. Eagles Rams. Yeah, that's going to be a really fun one. Yeah, this one's going to be a tough one for me to sit Devontae Smith just because I love the upside of this game. This is game number 12, Eagles Rams. Devontae Smith is in the yellow column because it hasn't been a terrific year for him. He's a boomer bust wide receiver 3 with a decent chance of booming in this potentially high scoring game. Not a scary matchup. We'll get to both of those things. Eagles Rams, it's a game that you want to get into your week 12 lineups. This is a game that you want exposure to. They have an over under of 48.5 points, which is the 3rd highest among all 13 games. Both teams are sporting top 13 implied totals of 23 or more, which suggests a possible shootout, plenty of fantasy football points. And again, if I had to build a fantasy football lineup out of just one game this week, Eagles-Rams would be very, very high on that list, if not at the very top. This is a game that you want exposure to. It's the same thing with the Eagles. Strong implied point total, 25.5 points. That's the 6th most among all the teams on the slate this week. This is an offense. The Eagles they're an offense that you want exposure to in your week 12 fantasy football lineups. Now Devontae Smith, it hasn't been pretty. He's averaging just 10.4 PPR points per game after 6 boom or bust games with AJ Brown, specifically with AJ Brown in the lineup. It's been different in the games that AJB missed, but with AJ Brown in the lineup, which he will in week 12, it's been very boom or bust. It's been very hit or miss for Devontae Smith. He scored 15 or more PPR points in 3 out of 6 games with AJ Brown, but he also scored fewer than 7 PPR points in the other 3 games with A.J. Brown. Like, he's either getting you 15 or he's getting you less than 7. The matchup itself, the Rams, mediocre. They're allowing the 11th most PPR points per game, including the 14th most yards and 4th most touchdowns. We like that, 4th most touchdowns. But they are holding wide receivers to the 5th fewest catches, which is kind of wild when you think about that. They're giving up the 14th most yards and 4th most touchdowns. That means the efficiency on those catches is wild. Like, they're not giving up a ton of volume, but when wide receivers catch the ball, they're doing a lot with it. 7 wide receivers in 10 games have scored 15 or more PPR points against the Rams. They're a bit of a boomer bust defense, which you don't see too often. Just 11 wide receivers in 10 games have been able to reach even just 11 PPR points against the Rams. Okay, so like barely one wide receiver per game is getting just 11 points. That's not even that much. But on the flip side, 4 wide receivers in 10 games have scored more than 24 points against the Rams, including eruptions of 37 from JSN, 46.5 from Juwan Jennings back in week 3. Like, they're either shutting you down or they're giving up a volcanic eruption. You can see the list of names that hit here. You can see the list of names that missed here. It's exactly what I said when I started answering this question. Aaron Jones and James Conner are going to be the safe plays. They're much, much safer fantasy football investments than Devontae Smith, especially in a half PPR league. So if you need safety, if you need floor, Jordan, it's Aaron Jones and it's James Conner, and it's not even close, for sure. If you're trying to swing for the fences, I'm okay with going Devontae Smith over Aaron Jones. James Conner's locked in either scenario. I'd be okay with Devontae Smith over Aaron Jones just based on that game, based on that shootout. But if you just need a safe collection of points, it's James Conner and it's Aaron Jones. Whew. That's a tough one, though. If you got to leave one of these 3 guys on your bench, you're doing all right. All right. Time for a drink of the old IPA. Guys, I can't emphasize this enough. People who use the heat map when setting their lineups win more frequently than people who don't use the heat map when setting their lineups. It's actual data. It's not me just like saying that. That's math. That's data. I surveyed as many possible people as I could. I just dropped a link to scoop it up in the comments. $4.99 for week 12, or you can get all of them for $1.90. I promise you won't regret it. And if you do, send me an email. I'll refund you. No questions asked. In all pennies. Okay. Here we go. I do OBJ says Lakefront is top tier. No doubt, my friend. I agree. I'd say, I don't know if you've ever had Enlightened Brewery. I think I'm going to do some of Tommy. Tommy's the guy who owns the brewery. I'm going to do some of his beers next week, I think. Which, let me know in the comments, guys. Should I do a Black Friday episode? It's iffy. Like, I don't know if it's one of those things where it's like, will people tune in because they're off work, or are people like, no, I'm with family? Like, what's going? So let me know. Should I do a Black Friday episode? Scott says, cut me deep, Mikey. Love IPAs. Yeah, man, it's hit or miss. It's Devontae Smith. People love IPAs or they hate IPAs. It's one or the other. Not saying people love or hate Devontae Smith. I'm saying it's hit or miss. It hits with people or it misses with people. Looks, oh man. I do OBJ says looks mostly good over here. Scott says couple blips. Oh man. All right, here we go. Hey, Tanner's up in the house. Heck yeah. He says, Tanner, I don't know if you're still here. I know you Fridays are a little bit busy for you. Alekos, what's up, dude? Good to see you here. So Alekos wants to know. All right, I see 2 here. I'm gonna try and pick one. There's okay, I'm gonna just start. I'm gonna probably just go with the top one for everybody, just because I'm assuming that's what's top of mind for them. If it's the first question asked, it's probably the most pressing question on your mind. He wants to know, Will Dissly or Mark Andrews? How weird has 2024 fantasy football been that this is a question? If you would have asked me in August during draft season, Will Dissly or Mark Andrews, I would have been like, what are you, nuts? Like, Will Dissly shouldn't even be on fantasy football rosters. And here we are. Week 12, and Will Dissly is absolutely an option, and Mark Andrews is WTF. Let's dive in. They're both in the same game. In fact, they're both right here. One is in the yellow column with a yellow dot. One is in the yellow column with a green dot. Now, this is important. That in and of itself does not mean that Will Dissly is a better play. It just means that knowing what we know about Will Dissly, I feel good about his situation this week. Knowing what we know about Mark Andrews, I feel just mediocre. I don't feel good. I don't feel bad. I just feel about Mark Andrews. These aren't rankings. Like, where these players are listed should not be compared to one another. Okay? That's very important. Let's start with Mark Andrews. Bottom line, touchdown or bust, tight end 1 play in this possible shootout against the only defense left in football that has not allowed a single touchdown to tight ends this season. The Chargers are the only defense left. 31 other teams have allowed at least 1 touchdown to tight ends. The Chargers have not. And you can look at that 2 different ways. 1, that means it's a really tough matchup for tight ends. Or 2, they're due. They should be allowing a touchdown soon. You look at that however you choose to. It's just data that I'm bringing to you. Now, this game in particular, it's like some of the others we've talked about. This is one you want exposure to. Mouth-watering over under 50.5 points, tied for the highest among all 13 games. Both teams have a top 11 implied total. It's going to be a shootout. If I had to build a lineup around one game, this would be at or near the very, very top of the list. The Ravens, it's the same story every week. You want exposure to the Ravens in your fantasy football lineup. They have a nice implied total of 26.7 points, tied for the 4th most among all teams in football. So theoretically, there's only 9. You want Ravens more than 9 other top 4. They're a top 4 team that you want fantasy football exposure to in week 12. They're 3-point favorites. So, expect a balanced / positive game script and balanced offensive approach. Now, Mark Andrews, man, it's been a roller coaster. 11 roller coaster games. He's averaging 9.1 PPR points, but just 3.5 targets. What that tells us is if he finds the end zone, he'll pay off. If he doesn't, he won't. That's the way that it's been all year. He scored 14 or more PPR points in 4 of 11 games. So just, 36.4% of the time. He scored fewer than 10 in 7 of 11 games. So 63.6% of the time he's getting you less than 10 PPR points. Not good. He has 2 different zeros, 2 different goose eggs on the year. None of that is what we want. Now, he is averaging 13 PPR points and 4.2 targets per game over the last 6 games, but that's largely because he's also scored 5 touchdowns in the last 6 games. Again, if he's scoring touchdowns, he pays off. If he doesn't score a touchdown, he does not pay off. So it's like as touchdown or bust as it gets at the tight end level. Now, the Ravens having the 4th highest implied total, being in a shootout, there's a solid chance Mark Andrews finds the end zone. If the Ravens are going to score 3-4 touchdowns, Mark Andrews is a good bet to be one of those touchdowns. But if he doesn't, now the matchup, Chargers are mediocre. They're holding tight ends to the 11th fewest PPR points per game. And again, largely because they're the only defense that has not allowed a single touchdown. They are giving up the 9th most catches, the 16th most yards. And if you want to look at this from a regression standpoint, they're allowing 5.6 catches and 49.1 yards per game to tight ends, but no touchdowns. If you think of just an individual tight end in a game that has 5 catches and 49 yards, decent chance that they'll score a touchdown. So you could say that mathematically, from a regression standpoint, the Chargers defense is bound to be on the wrong end of touchdown regression sooner rather than later. 3 tight ends in 10 games have scored 10 or more PPR points against the Chargers. Brock Bowers did it. Travis Kelce did it. Trey McBride did it. The only noteworthy name that kind of pooped the bed against the Chargers is David Njoku. Okay. I mean, it's Mark Andrews is as coin flip as it possibly gets at the tight end level, aside from Taysom Hill. He has to score a touchdown. He does have a good chance of scoring a touchdown, but that is what you're betting on. You're not betting on catches. You're not betting on yards. It's touchdown or bust. Okay. Then we got Will Dissly. Solid tight end 2, solid streamer in this high scoring game and strong matchup. Now, we already talked about the game. This is one you want exposure to. The Chargers offense isn't one to stay away from. They're tied for the 11th most, or they have the 11th highest implied point total. Will Dissly's getting you 10.1 PPR points per game over the last 6. Now, those games have been boom or bust, just like Mark Andrews, but he is getting you 6.3 targets per game, which is significantly more than Mark Andrews. Typically, that's the type of floor that I like to lean into in fantasy football. He scored 16.1 PPR points in week 7. He got you 18 PPR points last week, which, by the way, he was very high on the touchdown regression tab last week. And he found the end zone. Just saying, this stuff works. Other than that, though, Will Dissly scored fewer than 10 PPR points in 4 of the last 6 games. He has 5 or more targets in 5 of the last 6 games. That's noteworthy because Mark Andrews is not getting that kind of volume. And he's still on the touchdown regression tab because he has 37 catches and 352 yards, but he has just 1 touchdown on the season, which was last week when he was on this list as well. He's on the positive touchdown regression tab, although he did score just last week. So take that with a little grain of salt. Now, the matchup is a really good one. The Ravens are giving up the 9th most PPR points per game to enemy tight ends. That includes the 3rd most catches, 4th most yards. They are holding enemy tight ends to the 9th fewest touchdowns. But again, you could go the regression route on this one again, right? They're giving up 6.1 catches and 67-ish yards per game, but just 0.1 touchdowns per game, right? If you think of a tight end, let's say Cade Otton has 6 catches and 67 yards in a game, there's a decent chance part of that is going to be in the end zone. Point is, the Ravens could find themselves on the wrong end of touchdown regression as well when they're giving up so many catches, giving up so many yards. Eventually that pays off. Eventually that finds the end zone. 6 tight ends in the last 10 games have scored 10 or more PPR points against the Ravens, 5 of which scored at least 15. Brock Bowers, Jake Ferguson, Zach Ertz, Cade Otton, David Njoku, Tanner Hudson all hit. Travis Kelce and Dalton Kincaid are the only noteworthy names that missed. So, Mark Andrews or Will Dissly. It's wild that I'm in a situation where I'm saying this in the year 2024, but Will Dissly is going to be the quote-unquote safer bet, especially because the Chargers are usually favored. They're usually not an underdog. And this week against the Ravens, who might be the best team in football, the Chargers are underdogs. They're 3-point underdogs. It's not a huge spread, but the point is they might not be in a situation where they can just feed J.K. Dobbins 25 carries. Justin Herbert might have to throw the ball more than 30 times. And lately, Will Dissly's been a big part of that. If you guys want to dig way back, and I can find this for you guys if you want, but in my Chargers preview, and I wrote this about Hayden Hurst, not Will Dissly, but I wrote this about Hayden Hurst. But if you dig way back into Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh's first stint together with the San Francisco 49ers, their wide receivers did very little. Like Michael Crabtree was a solid option for them, but even he was never like a top 12 fantasy receiver. Like at best he did, I think, top 15 or top 20. And he hovered in that top 15, top 20, top 25 range. Vernon Davis, though, the tight end, he had fantasy football success through a good chunk of Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh's first stint together with the San Francisco 49ers. So it's not necessarily a surprise that a tight end is doing well in that offense. Tight ends usually do well in I always want to say Greg Roman's offense. Still, it's wild that we're sitting here talking about Will Dissly over Mark Andrews, but at this stage, as of November 22nd, 2024 at 12:58 p.m., Will Dissly is a safer bet at the tight end position than Mark Andrews is. And if it were me, I unfortunately would be going with Will Dissly here, especially if this is a PPR league. I don't know if it is or if it isn't, but I'd be going with Will Dissly. He's got a better matchup. He's on the touchdown regression tab. The defense that he's going against could hit touchdown regression. The Chargers are going to have to throw the ball more than they usually like to. Will Dissly's been one of the biggest beneficiaries of that. Ladd McConkey's dealing with an injury. It's weird. It's uncomfortable. Like, I want to tell you to go Mark Andrews. It's a much bigger name. But if this was me in my own fantasy football league, I'd be going with Will Dissly. Wild. Just wild. Anyway, hope that helps. Throw the Venmo QR code up on the screen. So I have no clue how to do that. But I can tell you that it's right here. Venmo is Basement Brood. So I'll toss it in the comments after I drop the week 12 heat map in the comments. But here's the Venmo if you're truly interested, Scott. Really appreciate that, sir. I don't know how to do the QR code thing right here live and on the spot, but there you go. I dropped it in the comments if anybody's feeling like they want to buy me my next IPA. I appreciate it. Man, it's always, my throat always starts to hurt when I'm doing these. We're about 1 hour in. I think we got another hour left. Let's keep it rocking. Once again, guys, in the comments, I dropped the link where you can scoop up the week 12 heat map for just for the cost of this, a beer, $4.99, or you can get every heat map, week 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, not week 18, wildcard, division, championship, not Pro Bowl, Super Bowl, for $1.90 per heat map. Scoop it up. And again, people who use the heat map win more frequently than people who don't. It's data. It's science. It's math. It's facts. All right, here we go. Jason Perry says, Jason, what's up, man? Good to see you in here. Really appreciate you popping in. I have no idea if you're still on. I know this question was from almost an hour ago. So if you're still on, thanks for waiting. If you're not, I don't blame you. Where does Danny Dimes end up? Man, that is a heck of a question. Dude, you got to wonder if, like, is it possible that one of the injury-ruined teams, like, Jerry Jones still wants to win football games? Like, does Dallas look at the former division foe? I mean, they seem like they're content with Cooper Rush, but Jerry Jones just yesterday said that Cooper Rush gives them the best chance of winning. I don't know why they traded for Trey Lance. Why in the world would you not take a look at him, especially if you're not pleased with how Dak Prescott, whatever, that's not what the question is. Dallas comes to mind. What about the Raiders? The Raiders desperately need an answer at quarterback. We know they're not pleased with Gardner Minshew. They already tried to move on from him once, but Aiden O'Connell got injured. Raiders seem like they make a lot of sense. Why not take a flyer on him? He's still young. That's the thing with Daniel Jones, is that he's still young and he's still a former first-round pick. Somebody is going to grab him and he's going to be looking to play somewhere. He's not going to want to be a bench option. Although I can't tell you, I can't recall a time where a starting quarterback with a first round pedigree gets cut in week 12 of the NFL season. That in and of itself is weird. But then for them to walk on and be a starting quarterback somewhere else when they don't even know the offense, I don't know. But the Raiders that's the first name that comes to mind. But you also wonder if maybe some of these teams with aging quarterbacks take a look at Daniel Jones and try and hide him on the bench so they can try and develop him, like somebody like the Rams, right? Eventually Matthew Stafford's getting up there. What about the Browns? I hope they stick with Jameis for fantasy purposes, but I don't know. I'm going to say the Raiders just to throw it out there. All right. U4Tube8 says, start 2 half PPR. Thank you for noting that. Debo, JSN, Neighbors, Downs. Okay, so we covered Debo. Generally speaking, we feel cautiously optimistic about Debo Samuel in week 12 if Brock Purdy plays. If he doesn't play, that's a different story. If he doesn't play, we're hoping it's Joshua Dobbs, but it could be Brandon Allen. All of that stuff matters. So let's move on to the next one, JSN. Okay. We already talked a little bit about Seahawks Cardinals. This is a game that we want exposure to in our week 12 fantasy football lineups. What do we got going on here? Oh man, anybody else get those super delayed email notifications? It's annoying. All right, here we go. Game 11, Cardinals Seahawks, JSN. Here he is. Pop it open. Bottom line, JSN, we're treating him like a wide receiver, low-end wide receiver 3 / high-end wide receiver 4 / flex when DK Metcalf's in the lineup. He does have some game script based upside in this potentially high scoring game. We already talked about it. This is a game you want exposure to. It's got shootout potential. There could be a lot of touchdowns. There could be a lot of fantasy points here. JSN is giving you about 12.1 PPR points per game over 8 full all over the place games alongside DK Metcalf. And what I mean by all over the place, he's given you 21 to 24 points in 2 of 8 games with DK Metcalf, including just last week, he scored 21.8. But he's also scored 10 to 13, which is a huge difference. 21 to 24, 10 to 13. He's getting you 10 to 13 points in 3 of 8 games. So he's doing that more frequently than getting you those big games. And then, even worse than that, he's given you less than 7 PPR points in 3 of 8 games. So in other words, in 6 out of 8 games with DK Metcalf, he's getting you 13 or less PPR points, half of which went under 7. That's not great, especially for a guy getting 8.3 targets per game. If you're getting 8.3 targets per game, usually those numbers look significantly higher. Now, again, he did have a great week last week and the week before and the game before that without DK Metcalf. The Cardinals against wide receivers, they're allowing they're right in the middle of the pack, 15th most PPR points per game, 10th most catches, and 13th most yards, holding wide receivers to the 12th fewest touchdowns. So none of that is scary. None of that is exciting. It's just all of it is average. All of it is mediocre. 6 wide receivers in 8 games have scored 15 or more PPR points against the Cardinals. That includes 2 that scored more than 20. But that said, those 6 wide receivers that scored 15 or more are also the only wide receivers to score 15 or more. So they did it in the last 8 games, but they're also the only wide receivers on the whole season to reach 15 or more PPR points in 10 games against the Cardinals this year. Just one wide receiver in the last 4 games has been able to reach even just 14 PPR points against the Cardinals. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Terry McLaurin, Brandon Ayuk, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Rome Odunze, all those guys hit against the Cardinals, but Khalil Shakir, Jamison Williams, Deebo Samuel, Jaden Reed, Ladd McConkey, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Devontae Adams, and Garrett Wilson all missed against Arizona. So there's really the only thing we like about JSN this week is the game itself. The fact that it's a potential shootout, a potential high-scoring game, plenty of passing volume, plenty of touchdowns. The Seahawks are underdogs, so it's like it's possible they fall behind and need to embrace a pass-heavy approach. But that's pretty much it. We don't love the matchup. We don't love what JSN's done for us so far this year alongside DK. Then we got Malik Neighbors. Now, this one is going to be an ultimate toss-up because on the one hand, you don't want to bench a guy that's getting you over 10 targets per game. On the other hand, that was with Daniel Jones. And now we're moving on to Tommy DeVito. Now, I did dig into this, so let me pull it up here real quick. Malik Neighbors. Bottom line, TLDR, we're treating him as a volume and matchup-based wide receiver 1/2 in week 12. The question is, can Tommy Cutlets get him the football? The game itself, we don't love it. Okay, Buccaneers, Giants, low over-under, 41.5 points, most of which belong to the Buccaneers. It's tied for the 3rd fewest among all 13 games on the Week 12 slate. The Giants have a dangerously low implied total. Okay, they're expected to score just 18 points this week. That's tied for the 5th fewest among all 26 teams. They're more of an offense that you want to target with the Buccaneers defense in fantasy football than an offense that you want to force into your Week 12 fantasy football lineups. They're 5.5-point underdogs. That's not necessarily a bad thing for Malik Neighbors because it means the Giants might have to throw the ball. He could be the beneficiary of several targets. But ultimately, the game, we're not expecting touchdowns from Malik Neighbors. We're hoping he racks up catches and yards. But if he's not expected to score a lot of touchdowns, that hurts in a half PPR league. Okay. Now, after 8 games in the NFL, he's getting you 17.4 PPR points per game, which includes 11.8 targets per game. Again, this dude's getting you 12 targets. Really difficult to bench that in any format. Any guy getting 12 targets a game is almost a shoe-in to get catches and yards. Okay. He scored 10 to 15 PPR points in 4 of 8 games, mixing in a low of 8.1, but he also scored 23 or more PPR points in 3 of 8 games, including 2 games over 28 points. He's now going to be catching passes from undrafted free agent Tommy DeVito, who doesn't exactly, this is where it gets a little bit scary, he doesn't exactly have a history of creating fantasy relevant wide receivers. In 5 full games with Tommy DeVito last season, Darius Slayton averaged just 8.1 PPR points and 4.4 targets per game. Wan'Dale Robinson averaged just 8 PPR points and 4.6 targets per game. And those guys were the best 2 wide receivers that the Giants had during that stretch. Those were the best wide receivers that the Giants had. Of course, the flip side of that is neither Darius Slayton nor Wan'Dale Robinson. Those guys aren't Malik Neighbors. Okay. Malik Neighbors is like a blueprint, blue chip type of prospect. That's a guy you build a fantasy roster around. That's a guy you build a NFL franchise around. We're talking like a Justin Jefferson level talent. That's not Wan'Dale Robinson. That's not Darius Slayton. So there is a counter argument to that. But when you look at the resume, it's not great. He didn't do a great job of creating a fantasy football weapon out of Darius Slayton or Wan'Dale Robinson. Wan'Dale Robinson himself has been solid this year under Danny Dimes. Darius Slayton has been solid filling in for Malik Neighbors under Danny Dimes. Can Tommy Cutlets get the ball to Malik Neighbors? That is the question. Now, if he can, the matchup is mouthwatering. Okay. The Buccaneers are giving up the 5th most PPR points per game, including the 4th most catches, 6th most yards, and 8th most touchdowns to enemy wide receivers. 9 wide receivers in the last 9 games have scored 15 or more PPR points against the Bucs. 5 in the last 9 games have gotten 22 or more, including 3 that scored more than 28. Okay, so they are just bleeding. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Bub Means, Rashad Bateman, Darnell Mooney, DeAndre Hopkins, Juwan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall, all those guys smashed against Tampa. Terry McLaurin did not in Jaden Daniels' first game in the NFL, and they didn't throw the ball very much, so does that really even count? Zay Flowers missed against Tampa, Drake London missed, and Deebo Samuel missed. So if Tommy can get Neighbors the ball, dude, he could do some serious damage against that defense. Josh Downs, we talked a little bit about because we don't love wide receivers in Anthony Richardson's offense. But again, it's the sort of thing that if you can get him the ball, the matchup is right. He's a high-end wide receiver 4/flex. He's got some matchup upside. He's got some game script upside. The hope here is that he racks up catches in a pass-heavy game script in a glorious matchup. Now, the Lions at Colts is tied for the highest over-under on the Week 12 slate, 50.5. But of course, most of that belongs to the Detroit Lions. The Colts implied total is just 21.5, which is subpar. It's tied for the 10th fewest among all 26 teams on the Week 12 slate. But there is some possible shootout potential here if Anthony Richardson and the Colts can exceed expectations a little bit. Now, the Colts are 7.5-point home underdogs. Now, that is one of those wide spreads that suggests a possible blowout loss. It suggests possible negative game script that could press the Colts into a pass-heavy approach, which could mean raised target potential for Colts pass catchers like Josh Downs. Now, in 4 full games with Anthony Richardson, 4 full boom or bust games with Anthony Richardson, Downs is getting you about 12 PPR points and 5.5 targets per game. That's not great. He scored fewer than 6 PPR points in each of the last 2 games. 6 or fewer PPR points in each of the first 2 games with Anthony Richardson. But then after that, he scored 19 or more PPR points in each of the last 2 games with Anthony Richardson, including a high of 22.2. The matchup is beautiful. The Detroit Lions, they're hemorrhaging the 4th most PPR points per game to wide receivers. That includes the most catches, 2nd most yards. And somehow after all that, after the most catches and 2nd most yards, the Lions are holding wide receivers to the 5th fewest touchdowns per game. That might be one of the weirdest stats I've ever seen. Imagine giving up more catches than any other of the 31 teams in football, the 2nd most yards among all 32 teams in football, but somehow after all that, keeping wide receivers out of the end zone. It's like I'll let you catch 10 passes for 199 yards, but I'm going to stop you at the 1 yard line every time. It's a weird number. They're giving up 15.7 catches, 188.7 yards per game, and yet just 0.6 touchdowns per game. So imagine Cooper Kupp has 16 catches and 190 yards. You'd think he'd be in the end zone, but the Lions are holding him to just 0.6 touchdowns per game. It's wild. So if you want to look mathematically, the Lions could be on the wrong end of touchdown regression sooner than later. It's a wild stat. Even still, 9 wide receivers in 10 games have scored 16 or more PPR points against the Lions. That includes 4 that scored more than 21. You can see the list of names here that hit. You can see the list of names here that missed. But ultimately, it's the same thing. If Anthony Richardson can get the ball to Josh Downs, he could do some damage against this defense. Now, that being said, you're putting Josh Downs and Malik Neighbors in a very, very similar situation, right? Can the quarterback get the guy the ball? And if he does, it's in a great matchup. And in that case, I'm taking Malik Neighbors. I'm taking that talent. I'm taking 11.5 targets per game. I mean, he's the focal point of the Giants offense. So Josh Downs is I shouldn't say out because there's 4 options here, but I would take Malik Neighbors over Josh Downs. Okay, so ultimately, TLDR, Deebo Samuel, we're cautiously optimistic. JSN, we're cautiously optimistic. Malik Nate, all of these guys were cautiously optimistic. That's just kind of the way it is. So if it were me and I had to choose 2 of these guys in a half PPR league, start 2, man. Josh Downs is out. Okay. To me, it's between Deebo, JSN, and Neighbors. Seahawks have an implied total of 23 points. 49ers are down to 21.75. Here's what I'll say. Josh Downs is out. If Brock Purdy is out, then Deebo is out. Okay. If Brock Purdy's out, then I'm going Neighbors and I'm going JSN. So there's that. Colts 21.5. Giants 18, so they're not going to score touchdowns, but man, he could just rack up catches. All right. If it were me, give me one last second just to, and sorry, like I always feel a little bit, I guess, awkward for lack of a better term, where I'm just sitting here thinking, but I always want to give you the best possible answer. I want to go through the situation as if it's my own. So sometimes I need to just look away and think, okay, if this is my league, what would I do? It sounds like it's obvious, but sometimes when you're like answering for other people versus, okay, if I'm sitting at my computer and making these decisions for myself, sometimes those answers can be a little bit different. So sometimes I just need to like look away and think for a second. What am I looking for here? Oh, Deebo. Yeah, I mean, 6.5 targets. It's just not working, but touchdown regression candidate. Okay. Here's what it is. Malik Neighbors is in. Jackson Smith and Jigba is in, regardless of whether or not Brock Purdy plays. I'd be going with those 2 guys. Because even if Brock Purdy does play, it's a shoulder injury. He could get knocked out at any moment. You got the Seahawks, who have the highest implied total out of all of them, right? So JSN theoretically has higher touchdown upside on a team that is expected to score more points than the 49ers, the Colts, and the Giants. So JSN's getting you 8+ targets per game. He's hot. He's on a roll. This game could, like, 47.5 point over under. This game could shoot out. JSN is a strong bet. And then you got Malik Neighbors, man. It's one of those like bet on talent, start your studs situations. I don't love their implied total. 18 points scares me. Like, the chances of Malik Neighbors scoring a touchdown are lower than these other guys. But dude, 11 to 12 targets per game, very clear focal point of the offense. That's not necessarily a Daniel Jones specific thing. The last thing I'll tell you here, YouTube, is Debo and JSN feel like much safer. Like there is risk to Malik Neighbors because we don't know what it's going to be like with Tommy DeVito. But man, you got a guy like Malik Neighbors. If you're a quarterback in the NFL, if you're a coach in the NFL, you're trying to get that dude the ball. So it's like, I'm not really even, and are we, Daniel Jones was benched for a reason. It's not like this is going to be some massive downgrade. It's not like Patrick Mahomes got hurt and they had to move on to their third string quarterback. They willingly chose the next guy. So it's not going to be that massive of a decision. So for me, I'm taking the guy getting 11 plus targets per game, hoping I get that right. And then I'm rolling JSN out there over Debo Samuel, hoping that I smash that one as well. But don't get me wrong here, man. This one is tough. It's like Josh Downs is out in my opinion. He's not even in this conversation, but those other three guys, it's like neck and neck. It's like 33% to 33% to 33%. So it's really, really tough. And I'm sorry that this one's not a quick light bulb for me, but for me, if it's me in my own league, half PPR league, I am going for JSN and Malik Neighbors. Final answer. Man, I hope that pays off. Yep, Scott said it here. Neighbors should dominate Tampa backs, but can Tommy get him the rock? All right, that is the question. All right, we got Mr. Juan Coronado hopping in here. Had Charles Tillman. I've been doing that a lot lately. Cedric Tillman. In my defense, I did suffer or sustain a mild concussion on Tuesday during basketball. So if I'm saying Charles Tillman, at least I have an excuse to fall back on. In fact, maybe I should just end the show. Like maybe you guys shouldn't be taking advice from a guy who's literally working with a mild concussion at this moment. Had Cedric Tillman on flex, got Chubb off waivers, weather equals run it. Yeah, man. I said to my wife yesterday that this is Nick Chubb weather. I wish he wasn't a shell of him. I shouldn't say a shell of himself because he'll be back, but we know it's not the Nick Chubb. But yeah, it was Nick Chubb weather yesterday. Scott says Vegas always knows. Yeah, man. I was telling my wife was asking about my process and why I put that stuff in the heat map. And it's like it's eerie how accurate Vegas is all the time. And why not use that to your advantage? Like so many fantasy football players make the mistake of going off their gut, right? It's like, oh, I have a feeling this guy. And that's fine. If that's what you want to do, that's part of the fun. I get that. You have a gut feeling and it pays off. That's a great feeling. It's just not the way I do things. I use data. I use math. I use analytics. I want to put myself in the best possible position to be right. Knowing I'm going to be wrong quite frequently, I'm giving myself a better chance of being correct than the people that are using their gut. I'm sorry to say it. But yeah, so why not use part of that data being Vegas? Anyway. All right. What do we got next? Justice Reborn, Murray or Herbert this week? Oof. Man, I got to get better at reading these before I select them because I don't want to answer this question. All right, let's hop into it. Actually, this is a good one to hop in because we've already talked a little bit about some of this stuff. Kyler Murray. Again, we already talked about this game, right? We want exposure to this game. Cardinals have a strong implied total, 24.5. Kyler is a confident QB1 play, potentially high-scoring game, bleeding matchup. Kyler's killed this matchup in his career. I already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to go through the process anyway. Kyler's getting you 18.5 fantasy points per game after 10 games. He scored 16 or more. So 60% of the time he's getting you at least 16. 50% of the time he's getting you at least 20. He has a high of 28.74 points. That happened his last time on the football field in week 10. His career against Seattle, he's averaging 20.4 fantasy points per game over 7 full career contests against the Seahawks. He scored 16 or more fantasy points in 6 of 7 games, or about 86% of the time. He's getting you at least 16 fantasy points against the Seahawks. And he's never, ever, ever scored fewer than 14.9 fantasy points per game, or fantasy points against Seattle. Technically speaking, the Seahawks are currently, after the entire season, after 11 weeks, they are currently holding enemy quarterbacks to the 14th fewest fantasy points per game. Now, that said, they are absolutely bleeding, arguably hemorrhaging lately. 6 quarterbacks in the last 7 games have scored 17 or more fantasy points against the Seahawks. That includes 2 that scored more than 22. Okay. So 6 of the last 7 quarterbacks have smashed against Seattle. They are the only 6 to reach 12 fantasy points against Seattle this year, but it's all been happening in the last 7 games. So Seattle's defense started hot, but they've been bleeding a little bit lately. Jared Goff, Daniel Jones, Brock Purdy, Josh Allen, Matthew Stafford, Brock Purdy, all of those guys hit. The names that missed were Bo Nix in his very first NFL game. Like, are we really going to expect a lot? Jacoby Brissett missed against the Seahawks, but he's not even a starting quarterback in the NFL anymore. Dolphins quarterbacks that were not Tua Tagovailoa. So we're talking about Skylar Thompson, not Mike White, Tim Boyle. Who was the other one? Whatever, not Tua, and then Kirk Cousins. Okay, and Kirk Cousins has been as hit or miss as possible this year. So the list of names that missed against Seattle, you could pretty much predict they were going to miss against Seattle. So Seattle's bleeding. They're not as tough as they look. You see, they're holding 14th fewest fantasy points per game. They're not as tough as you might think. Kyler has killed these guys in his career. He's getting you 19 points per game. Love Kyler this week. Strong quarterback one play. Now, that's not to take away from Justin Herbert, because we like Justin Herbert this week as well. In fact, this week, week 12, is the first week that Justin Herbert's appeared in the green column. So that tells you a little something. We've talked plenty about the game. 50.5 point over under. You want exposure to this game. You want exposure to the Chargers, 23.75 implied total. Justin Herbert's on fire. Over the last 4 games, he's averaging 22.4 fantasy points per game, scoring 19 plus fantasy points in 4 of them, 2 games over 24. He's coming off a season high, 26.38 points last week. The Ravens are hemorrhaging points against quarterbacks, 4th most. They're giving up 20.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's the 4th most in football. That includes the most yards and 4th most passing touchdowns, which is where Justin Herbert butters his bread. 6 quarterbacks in the last 9 very nice games have scored 20 or more fantasy points against the Ravens, including 5 of the last 7. 5 QBs in the last 9 games have scored 25 or more fantasy points against the Ravens, including 33.78 points from Joe Burrow in week 5, and then another 33 points from Joe Burrow in week 10. Dak hit against them. Burrow hit against them twice. Jaden Daniels, Baker, Jameis Winston, all those guys did well against Baltimore. Patrick Mahomes did not. Gardner Minshew predictably did not. Josh Allen did not. They got whooped in that game. Bo Nix did not, and Russell Wilson did not. So the question of Kyler versus Herbert, I mean, you can't go wrong here, but if it's me and I'm making this decision, I'm taking Kyler Murray personally. He's going to give you the safest combination of floor plus ceiling. Like, he's got a pretty safe floor, especially since he's a rushing quarterback. Like, a lot of times you see rushing quarterbacks run into tough matchups, and it doesn't even matter because they still get 60, 70 rushing yards. But he's got a good matchup, a better matchup than it looks. He's going to be in a shootout just like Justin Herbert is. They have a higher implied point total. He's killed the Seahawks in the past. They're trying to hang on to first place. Like, there's a lot working in Kyler. Both of these guys favor, but Kyler is going to give you the safer floor plus ceiling combination. But again, this is one of those things where it's like 52 to 48. Like, it's not like, oh yeah, Kyler Murray, definitely not Justin Herbert. It's like pretty neck and neck. I'd say 52 to 48 because Herbert's playing insanely well. He's got a great matchup, great shootout. They're going to have to throw the ball, but you have to get touchdown passes from Justin Herbert for him to pay off, where Kyler can get you points with his legs. So I'm going Kyler there. All right, here we go. Dave Flynn says, do I go Javonte Williams or Rashawn this week? I think you got to go Javonte here. It's a complete roll of the dice. Both of these guys are going to be a complete roll of the dice. Now, I will say, In the Bears' first game under Thomas Brown, their new offensive coordinator last week, Roschon Johnson had, I believe, 10 touches, and most encouragingly, they used him near the goal line. So he's going to be like a kind of like Gus Edwards used to be, like a touchdown or bust type of RB3 streamer. Look, I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. Javonte Williams is a huge risk considering what we saw. Like, they're playing this flip-flop game, right? I mentioned it here. In week 10, Javonte Williams took a back seat to Audric Estime. Week 10, this is just 2 weeks ago. Not last week, but the week before. Javonte Williams had just 3 touches. In fact, there were a couple people right here on this show that asked about Javonte Williams, and unfortunately, I said you can't put Javonte Williams in your lineup because he just had 3 touches. I was wrong about that. He ended up getting back in. I wish I wasn't wrong, but that's the way that it worked. But just 2 weeks ago, he handled just 3 touches. But then last week, he had 13 touches to Estime's 9. Now, Estime has been involved enough in both games to be an option. Javonte Williams was very involved in one, not at all involved in another. That makes him risky. But, man, there's a lot working in Javonte Williams' favor this week if he's going to be the guy. The Broncos have a solid implied total, 24 points, so there's some touchdown upside there. The Broncos are 6.5-point road favorites, which is a wide-ish spread that suggests a possible blowout win, meaning they should be able to keep the positive game script. They should be able to keep the ball on the ground. And the matchup is nice. The Raiders are allowing the 7th most PPR points per game to enemy running backs. That includes the 10th most touches, 16th most scrimmage yards, 7th most running back touchdowns, 13th most rushing yards on the ground, 12th most rushing touchdowns on the ground. They're even friendlier through the air, which Audric Estime is not really like. Javonte is more of the pass catching back than Estime is. Raiders are giving up the 8th most catches, 5th most receiving touchdowns. That's despite holding them to the 16th quote unquote fewest receiving yards, but that doesn't mean anything. 9 running backs in 10 games have scored 15 or more PPR points against the Raiders, including 5 that scored more than 20. So almost 1 running back per game. And if I were to make a bet on any running back from Denver getting 15 or more points against the Raiders, it would be Javonte Williams. So ultimately, and you look at the list of names that hit, there's a lot. You look at the list of names that missed, there's not many. And Gus Edwards is one of them. So is that really a miss? Like, the Raiders give up production to running backs. It's a total roll of the dice, and you're at risk of him handling 3 touches and getting you 0. But Roschon Johnson's he's far from a sure thing. It's not like we're expecting Roschon Johnson to be this sure bet for 20 plus touches. And he's got a really, really, really brutal matchup. The Vikings are impossible on running backs. They're holding them to the 2nd fewest PPR points per game. They're tough on the ground, holding them to the 3rd fewest rushing yards, 4th fewest rushing touchdowns. The Bears are 3.5-point underdogs. It's possible that they have to abandon the run at some point. They're only expected to score 18 points, so not a lot of touchdowns, and that's really what you're hoping with. So for me, I'd be going Javonte Williams, and I feel that's like a 90-10 for me. And I understand that there's a risk there, but the upside for Javonte Williams definitely outweighs the risk. I think the risk on both guys is similar, but the upside is much, much, much more in favor of Javonte Williams. I feel really strongly about that one. Hope that helps. Whew, I'm hitting that part of the day where I'm starting to feel exhausted, my friends. Guys, if you like what you're seeing with the weekly heat map, which is what's on the screen here, again, I did a survey of everybody in my email list, and I said, did you use the heat map? How many matchups did you win? How many matchups did you lose? The people that did not use the heat map won 50% of their matchups exactly. The people that did use the heat map won 64% of their matchups. Okay. People who use this when they're setting their lineups win their matchups more frequently than people who don't. If you want to scoop it up, I just dropped a link for you in the comments. You can get week 12, which is the one that we're looking at, for the cost of this or less than the cost of this, $4.99, or you can get every heat map from now through the Super Bowl for $1.90 per heat map. All right. What's next? Oh my God, that's a brilliant idea. Tanner, I don't know if you're watching, but we should totally do this. Add the QR code to your blue banner on either side of your video window. Then it's always visible and people can snap and donate. Whew. Scott, I got to hire you for I don't know, business ideas because that's brilliant. That's such a smart idea. Tanner, there you go. All right. Jonah Guerreta says Stafford, Stroud, or DeVito. I'm hurting for a quarterback. DeVito's out. Okay. You got the Giants expected to score 18 points. That's their implied point total this week. Yes, they do have the greatest possible matchup that a quarterback could ask for. That's why there's a number 1 next to the Buccaneers under quarterback. That's part of what the heat map says here. Sorry, I need to take a breath. That headache is really starting to kick in here. But I mean, Tommy DeVito is going to be more of a wait and see type of quarterback. Last year, he averaged 15.3 fantasy points per game over 5 full games. Ooh, that is not how you spell games. After 5 full games last season, he scored 10 to 14 PPR fantasy points in 3 of 5 games, but he did mix in a couple bigger outings of 17.4, 22.5. More often than not, though, he was getting you 10 to 14 fantasy points. Great matchup. The Buccaneers are giving up 23.5 fantasy points per game. 8 and 10 quarterbacks have gotten at least 18 points. So the matchup is there, but given the options that you have, I would not be going with Tommy DeVito this week. Again, the Giants have an implied point total of just 18 points. We're not expecting many touchdowns out of New York, and that's what you need to pay off in fantasy football, especially at the quarterback level. So let's look at Matthew Stafford. Now, he's playing well enough to warrant quarterback 2/streamer consideration in this potential shootout, but there's also no denying he has a tough matchup in week 12. We've talked about the game itself. We want exposure to the Eagles-Rams game. We want exposure to the Rams. They have a much better implied point total than the Giants at 23 points. Matthew Stafford is balling since he got his guys back. He's getting 20.1 fantasy points per game in 4 games since Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua returned. He got 17 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. But man, Philly's tough. They're holding quarterbacks to the 4th fewest fantasy points per game, not even 13. Quarterbacks are averaging fewer than 13 fantasy points per game against the Eagles this year. Not good. That includes the 2nd fewest passing yards, 5th fewest passing touchdowns. They are allowing the 6th most quarterback rushing touchdowns per game, but that doesn't help Matthew Stafford at all. Just 4 quarterbacks in 10 games have been able to score even just 13 fantasy points against the Eagles, just 1 of which has been within the last 6 games. Jordan Love did well against Philly. Kirk Cousins, Baker Mayfield, Trevor Lawrence, all those guys did well. But Derek Carr, Deshaun Watson, Daniel Jones, Joe Burrow, Cooper Rush, and Jaden Daniels all missed the mark against Philly. Now, that said, you could say that Joe Burrow and Jaden Daniels are really the only noteworthy names in that list. But still, Jaden Daniels was just last week, and he didn't do anything against the Eagles on Thursday Night Football. So ultimately, we just feel meh about Matthew Stafford. He's playing well. He's in a high-scoring game that should feature touchdowns, but he's got a brutal matchup. Last but not least, Mr. CJ Stroud, who I'm with you. I have him in my high-stakes league, and it's hurting this year. Talent pace QB 1/2, not scary matchup, and encouraging implied point total. Now, the Texans, among all 3 teams that are in this Giants, Rams, Texans, the Giants have the highest implied point total. And that's something we want. That's something we look at when we're considering quarterbacks. They have a projected total of 25 points. The Texans are strong 8.5-point home favorites. Now, that means they can keep the ball on the ground. Mixon's been eating. But we'll talk about Mixon in 1 second. CJ Stroud hasn't been going well. 14.2 fantasy points per game. Scored fewer than 15 fantasy points in 7 of 11 games. No need to even... He's thrown... Oh, I put this on Twitter. He's thrown 2 touchdowns since October 13th. 2 touchdowns in over a month. But 3 interceptions. Not good. The matchup, though. Now, technically, the Titans are allowing the 12th most fantasy points per game, 17.3 to enemy quarterbacks, but that's largely because they don't intercept the ball, just 0.3 times per game, and they get burned by rushing quarterbacks. They're giving up the 7th most rushing yards and 3rd most rushing touchdowns, but strictly through the air, the Titans are actually an above average defense. They're holding quarterbacks to the fewest passing yards and the 16th fewest passing touchdowns per game. Still, though, 7 quarterbacks in 10 games have been able to score 15 or more fantasy points against the Titans, including 3 that scored more than 21. But if you remove all the rushing stats, then just 4 quarterbacks in 10 games were able to reach 15 points against the Titans. Each of the last 5 quarterbacks to face the Titans has been able to score at least 15 fantasy points against them, including a season high of 25.64 from Sam Darnold just last week. So ultimately, Tommy DeVito's out. There's not anything that's encouraging about and I mentioned I would talk about Joe Mixon. All I was going to say about Joe Mixon is that he has a tough matchup. So he might not have very easy sledding against the Titans, but of course, CJ Stroud isn't necessarily teed up either. If it were me and I'm making this decision, I would try and ride the hot hand with Matthew Stafford in this shootout, right? If the Rams are going to be playing from behind, if this game's going to be a shootout, if there's going to be a lot of points, Matthew Stafford's going to have to throw the ball. Cooper Kupp's healthy. Puka Nakua's healthy. There is some upside there, some touchdown upside there. Even though the Texans have a higher implied point total, it's also possible they get those points from the rushing game and from their defense as heavy favorites. So it's uncomfortable, but I would go with Stafford. I would say it's like 55 Stafford, 44 Stroud, 1 DeVito. Actually, just 0 DeVito. So 55 Stafford, 45 Stroud. That's where I would go. All right, guys, I am going to start wrapping this up. My head is starting to absolutely pound. So I'm just going to do kind of a quick scroll through here, see if there's anything that I can hammer out quickly. Here's what I will say, though. I know there's a lot of you that might have questions for me, and I want to make sure I get to those. I'm going to drop my email, Mikey@basementbroodff.com. I just dropped my email in the comments. If I don't get to your question, please, please, please feel free to send me an email and I will do my best to respond to you that way. My head is really, I don't know. My head is starting to feel like it's going to explode. So, all right. Let me just scroll through. My guy Lane, what is up, Lane? Guys, if you didn't catch my off-season episode with Lane Taylor, former offensive lineman for the Green Bay Packers, the guy spent 9 years blocking for Aaron Rodgers and protecting Aaron Rodgers. That was such an awesome conversation, awesome episode. Lane's turned into a great friend of mine. Really, really recommend checking that episode out. It's over on the Basement Brood Fantasy Football YouTube channel. Check out that episode. It was a good conversation with Lane Taylor. We talked football, of course. We talked Aaron Rodgers, but we also talked barbecue. We talked about a lot of really good stuff. Lane wants to know if he should go with his former buddy or his current buddy, his former teammate, Aaron Jones, or Kareem Hunt. Dude, so Kareem Hunt is a mega dice roll this week, right? Because Isaiah Pacheco's theoretically coming back. I have not caught up on Isaiah Pacheco news since like Wednesday. So forgive me if there's been any news breaks, but if Pacheco's going to go, we don't know anything about snap counts. We don't know anything about how limited or unlimited he'll be. But if Kareem Hunt gets a chance, man, he has literally the best possible matchup that a running back could ask for against the Carolina Panthers. And the way that I'm approaching Kareem Hunt this week is that he's a high risk, massive upside RB2. Like, I don't think with how well he's been playing, the guy's been getting 23 plus touches per game. I don't think the Chiefs are just going to like forget that he exists. It doesn't seem likely that the Chiefs will just rush Isaiah Pacheco back into a 20 touch role. I think Kareem Hunt is going to be plenty involved where he could just absolutely smash against the Carolina Panthers. The Chiefs are dominant, 10.5 point road favorites. So positive game script. They should be able to keep the ball on the ground. They don't need to ask Patrick Mahomes to do too much to win this game. The Panthers are giving up the most PPR points per game to enemy running backs, which includes the most touches, the most scrimmage yards, and the most touchdowns. They're literally the worst in football in every relevant category that are running. Like, they're giving up the most, where was it? Most touches. So they're giving up more volume than any other defense. They're giving up more yards than any other defense. Running backs are scoring more touchdowns against the Panthers than anybody else. Like, it's unbelievable how mouth-watering of a matchup this is. They're allowing the most rushing yards, most rushing touchdowns to running backs. 9 running backs in 10 games have scored at least 17 PPR points against the Panthers. 6 running backs in 10 games have scored 20 or more. Like, look at this list of names that have hit against Carolina compared to the list of names that did not. And that list consists of Gus Edwards, who lost his job to J.K. Dobbins, Zamir White, who lost his job to Alexander Madison, and Javonte Williams, who lost his job to Audric Estime for a week. So, man, dude, if we find out that Isaiah Pacheco is not going to play this week, it's Kareem Hunt, and it's Kareem Hunt to the moon. Like, he's a legitimate RB1 overall upside type of running back. Like, if we find out Isaiah Pacheco is not going to play, Kareem Hunt is going right here. He's going in the blue column, which I'm just now realizing nobody's in there this week. He's like mouth-watering upside for Kareem Hunt. But if Isaiah, ultimately, like, keep an eye on player news. If we find out anything about Isaiah Pacheco's availability, his snap counts, any of that stuff that suggests Kareem Hunt is going to get the lion's share of the workload, it's Kareem Hunt. Like, the upside is just too mouth-watering not to. But if you're looking for safety and guaranteed points, Aaron Jones is going to be a safer play because we know that there's 15 touches on the table for Aaron Jones, assuming health and assuming no injuries. So, Lane, obviously, feel free to shoot me a text like on Sunday morning when we know more about where we're at with Isaiah Pacheco. Shoot me a text on Sunday morning and we'll sort through this together. But, dude, the upside for Kareem Hunt, if Pacheco sits out just one more week, is just massive. All right. Hey, Scott, what's up, man? Mike, thank you for the NFL Fantasy League. Can wrap up a playoff spot this week. So Scott is referring to, so this year I threw together, like, last second, like late August, I threw together an NFL fantasy football league, meaning there's 32 fantasy football players, each of which assumed the role of general manager of every team in the NFL. I'm the general manager of the New York Giants, definitely making a lot better personnel decisions than the actual New York Giants. Just saying, New York, if you guys are looking for a real GM, just kidding. But Scott is in the NFL Fantasy Football League, and we're coming down to the end of the season, and there's some really interesting divisional races, wild card races, so it's pretty cool. Lane, who I was just answering Lane's question, Lane's in there. Lane is the general manager of the Cincinnati Bengals in that league. But Scott, I'm really glad that you're enjoying it. I'm thinking about, like, trying to turn it into a dynasty league in the future, which I think would be pretty cool. But anyway, good luck with the concussion. Don't go to sleep anytime soon, but turning off your lights might help the headache. Stay hydrated. Yeah, with this beer. I probably shouldn't be drinking this, but hey, man, the show must go on, as they say. I appreciate it. It's a mild concussion. I took an elbow to the head, but still, there's nothing about it that's fun. Oh, baby. Reed says Isaiah Pacheco will not play against the Panthers. Thank you, Scott. This is awesome. Kareem Hunt, my friend, you are moving in to the blue column. In fact, I saw another question in here. Inferno Fantasy Football asked Tony Pollard to Kareem Hunt. It's Kareem Hunt. It's Kareem Hunt over everybody. Like, the guys, if you give a guy 23 touches against the Carolina Panthers, holy cripes. Like, I'd be so excited to put Kareem Hunt into every lineup that I possibly could this week. Tony Pollard, I'm not at all excited about. That sounded very Canadian. The Titans have a teeny tiny implied point total of 16.5 points. They're 7.5 point underdogs, so they might have to abandon the run. The Texans are holding running backs to the 5th fewest PPR points per game. I would not, if I had to make like a love or hate list and I had to put guys into one column or the other, Tony Pollard would be out. I would want nothing to do with Tony Pollard this week. Man, this is so exciting. Reed says Pacheco will not play. Like, I'm rooting for Pacheco, don't get me wrong, but gosh, when I was writing that entry, I'm like, man, we're going to have to do this whole, like, who's going to get how many touches? But now that we know that Kareem Hunt's going to get 20 plus touches against Carolina, whew, giddy up. Wheels off, baby. Vikings are due for a big game. Go Jones. Yeah, I mean, Lane, now that we know it's Pacheco's not going to play, of course I should fact check. I should probably not just assume that Scott could be trolling us, but Scott's a good dude. I don't think he would troll us. If it is in fact true that Isaiah Pacheco is not going to go, whoo, give me Kareem Hunt even over Aaron Jones. But I do like Aaron Jones this week. I think Jason's right. I do like Aaron Jones, but if Kareem Hunt has a green light and Isaiah Pacheco has a red light, whew. Yep. Here we go. Scott says Pacheco's out. Scott says ESPN said Pacheco's out. Scott's the Patriots in the NFL league. That would be a great dynasty. Yeah, man, I'll think about it. I can't take this year's NFL league and turn it into a dynasty because people didn't draft accordingly, but maybe next year we'll start it up that way. All right, guys, I have gotten to the bottom of the comments list, and I'm going to call it because I need to rest. All right. But if anybody else has any other basementbroodff.com, if anybody else has any other fantasy football questions for week 12, I just dropped my email in the comments. Feel free to send me an email. No guarantees, but I will do my best to reply to people's start-sit questions via email once I put my face back into my phone. I'm going to get away from screens here for a little bit. But send me an email if you'd like. And again, last time I'll mention it. If you guys are loving what you're seeing with the heat map, and you should, I mean, there's a reason it blew up on Reddit. There's a reason I quit my corporate job. There's a reason I'm doing this full time. Jokes aside, I did just drop in the comments a link where you can scoop up week 12 for the cost of this one beer, $4.99, actually less than the cost of one beer. Or you can get the whole rest of the season all the way through the Super Bowl for $1.90. Again, I surveyed my entire email list, and of the people who did not use the heat map when setting their lineups, they won 50% of their matchups exactly. But the people who did use the heat map when setting their lineups won 64% of their matchups. So quite frankly, people who use this beautiful, beautiful colored heat map when setting their lineups win more frequently than people who don't. It's just facts, it's science, and it's data, and it's math at this point. And like my friend Jordan Poggle said, you can't argue with the math. So the link to scoop that up is in the comments. I just dropped it in the comments. Other than that, meet me back here. Oh, you guys didn't let me know if we're going to do a Black Friday show. As of right now, I am planning on doing the Black Friday show next week, next Friday, every Friday at noon Central on the Basement Brood Fantasy Football YouTube channel or Facebook or Twitch or wherever the heck this is. I don't even know anymore where we're at. But at worst, you can always find it on the Basement Brood Fantasy Football YouTube channel. Guys, if you tuned in today, I can't thank you enough. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the Basement Brood Fantasy Football YouTube channel. And yeah, if you scoop up the heat map, whether it's week 12 or for the rest of the season, I cannot thank you enough, guys. Building a business is by far the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life. So building a YouTube audience, getting people to, turn from subscribers into customers and join us on the Discord channel, all of those things are so impossible. So whether you tuned in today or whether you scoop up the heat map, I can't thank you enough. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. And having you guys all here with me, it means more than I'll ever be able to put into words. So thank you. I will see you next Friday, noon Central, live Basement Brood Fantasy Football YouTube channel for week 13. It's going to be a chaotic week with Thanksgiving coming up, but that's going to be all for today. Cheers. This brew's for you.